fearless face.
I just have to use this camera. So I need a double tap. Yes. I'll be talking everyone.
It's on. It's on.
Hello everyone, welcome to the public debate on religion and animal activism. The resolution is religion is a negative force in promoting animal rights. First speaking on the proposition will be Kim Sosha. Thank you.
So, 8 minutes, and I'll time myself, but please, if I sure. So, I first want to begin by saying the animal rights or liberation movement, I would call it the animal liberation movement, is a secular movement. Maybe not a consciously secular movement. Sociological, from major sociological studies to anecdotal evidence will show that people who identify as atheists, agnostic, freethinkers, other terms, are drawn to the animal liberation movement, and this has been studied about why those connections are made. It's not to say that there are not religious people in the movement, but it is fueled and currently dominated, for lack of a better word, by people who have given up the idea of a higher power. And what I will argue, in giving up a higher power, you give up your sense of human divinity, in a sense, or humans being the apex of life on Earth. And the studies have borne that out. Once I gave up belief in God, I saw that I was just another animal trying to survive. So a connection is felt with other animals who are trying to survive as well. I do want to state that and I've read these arguments, I think creative and I would say possibly secular readings of religious texts can lead to compassion for animals, can lead to arguments for better treatment, for welfare, better welfare standards for animals, but not to animal liberation. So I think that's going to be a key to help you understand where I'm coming from. What do I think liberation is? That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and even my definition isn't exactly on point. To me, animal liberation is not about opening the cage doors and letting all of the animals free. It is about liberating the human mind from the perception of our own supremacy, and liberate the human mind, the human consciousness, from this idea that other creatures exist, so we can use them as we please for food, for clothing, as technology, in the many ways that we use them. So that's what I think animal liberation is, but it's also opening the cage doors to that. And I'll explain 3 reasons why religion, and it's hard to speak of religions as one whole entities. I'm going to focus on a few, and even that is somewhat limiting, and it's a broad overview. I know there is not one Christianity overview. The 3 reasons that religions are inherently incapable of speaking to animal liberation, as I have defined it, are anthropocentrism, the belief that human life is the center of life on Earth, the idea that all of nature, animals, and green nature exist for human ends. Speciesism, religions are inherently speciesist because of anthropocentrism. If humans are the most important animal species on the planet, then of course we have more rights, our lives matter more, our pain matters more, our families matter more, and our emotions matter more than other species. And hierarchy. And what I want to specify is when I talk about hierarchy, I'm actually talking about a specific type of hierarchy arising from Aristotelian thought from ancient Greek, I was going to say mythology. These are real people. Ancient Greek philosophers, this idea of a very strictly demarcated view of the world. There's God, there's angels, there's demons, there's man, there's woman, notably, and then there's dumb animals in the parlance of rationalist philosophers, and then plants and minerals. That's a traditional way that I think the world still works today. Well, I'm going to talk about Eastern religions, may not be hierarchical in that sense, but they do have very strictly demarcated views of the world and rebirths, which I will get to in a moment. So first, a bit about Christianity is, I noted the great chain of being is what I was referring to, the hierarchy. Christianity, why I think it's, if you use that as a tool to entice people into accepting animal liberation as I see it, they can so easily, if anyone just took a moment, which many religious people do not take those moments to actually read the Bible, you will clearly see that God gives humans the right, it's not required, but gives humans the right, this is in Genesis, all animals will live in fear of you. That is clearly stated. Animals exist for human purposes. So if someone is Christian and you want to use the Bible in that way, I don't have time. I could pull examples from the New Testament as well. You know, there's the mean Old Testament and the nice New Testament. So it's very clearly laid out. So someone could go to that text and say, oh, that activist I spoke to is wrong. My God says I can do this. Often seen as the exception, and in some ways it is better. I want to say there are gradations, of course. It's better for animals are some Eastern religions, but ultimately not sufficient, because I think in many ways in the West they are not understood. Part of the reason Buddhists, Hindus, and Jains, again from a very traditional perspective, the reason they don't consume animals is not necessarily because animals have inherent worth. They acknowledge that animals suffer, which is wonderful, and they say you don't want to ingest that fear and that terror, and therefore start building on this karmic burden. So there's not an idea of animals have a right to live because they exist for their own purposes. It's how does this affect me as a human in the Buddhist wheel of life, to live a negative life as a human. You will be reborn into another sector, which is the animal realm. So clearly we see these demarcations. Humans are not animals in a sense, clearly distinct. And that's, again, an anthropocentric viewpoint. The final example I want to give is Jainism is often seen as an exception to this because of the extreme paths people take in Jainism to avoid hurting other species. But again, that is done for the human, for purposes of human ascension. So for example, if a Jain, this is traditionally, were to see an animal suffering, let's say in a slaughterhouse, there would be no moral imperative to rescue that animal because the animal earned that karmic burden in another life, and they have to suffer through that to be, they have to suffer through that to be reborn as a human. And if an animal is suffering in pain, there is not a moral obligation to try to stop that animal's pain, again because of the suffering. So again, while there's less death, it is not because animals have inherent worth, which again is what I think the purpose of animal liberation should be, to see that animals exist for their own purposes, and that purpose is not whatever makes humans happy. Thank you.
TJ Tuckeray will now cross-examine the social.
Okay. So my first question is, you bring up this great point about how hierarchies within current religious structure kind of prevent us from, having this view of viewing animals as equal. Do you think that these hierarchies are inevitable in all forms of religion, or is this just the way that religion exists today? Like, so you think there is a possibility where these hierarchies don't exist? Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I believe that, and again, I've had to go in and define religion, and religion is almost always, and this is arguable because some would argue that Buddhism and atheism are, as some say, Buddhism is an atheistic religion, or Jainism is an atheistic religion, but clearly this idea of rebirths contradicts that idea. So I think that hierarchies are always inevitable when you have an idea of a higher power. Because even if we were to, let's say, level the playing field as human beings in this magical future where we're all equal, we would all still owe a deference to a higher power, and that is innately hierarchical. Even if we remove a bunch of the levels from the ladder, there's still one above.
Okay, thank you. Now my next question would be, you make a point about how reincarnation is probably problematic because the only reason that people who follow those religions actually, are kind to animals is for their own purpose, and so that they can go into the human realm and not be put in the animal realm. But isn't the ability for this within those religions? Doesn't the ability that those spirits can travel from body to body, like from animal? There's no distinction between a spirit traveling to an animal body and a human body. Doesn't the fact that those religions believe that they do that kind of show some sense of equality between, showing that there's not a lot of difference between the human and animal body, those spirits can travel back and forth?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's why I think Eastern religions are preferable to
Okay.
Western, absolutely. But there's still, even though there's the ability to be reborn, there's still that sense of, and in the actual terminology used in some of the texts that I've read are, this is a quote, so I don't want to be ableist, but if you live in idiocy and stupefaction, you will become a non-human animal. So even if there is that ability, like that samsara, the transmigration of souls, it still comes down to the division.
So that leads to my next question. Even if say maybe the meaning behind these religions are problematic, is it still valuable that they do stop harming animals and they do abstain from eating animals? Isn't that still valuable even if their intentions may not be what we would wish that they were?
Yes, I think it's valuable, but it's eventually going to be an obstacle to true liberation.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Next, Drew Segal will be speaking for 8 minutes.
Hi everyone, my name is Drew Segal. I'm a varsity member here of the Binghamton Speech and Debate Team. I'm a junior majoring in English, and I'm excited to be joining you all here for a fun and informed debate. And with that, let's get started. Religion is an important part of everyday life that affects most people in this country, whether or not a person practices it. 56% of Congress is Protestant, compared to 48% of the public, and 30.6% are Catholic in Congress, compared to 22% of the public. Religion is dominant, here to stay, and something we must work with when it comes to the question of animal liberation, not abandon it completely as the proposition seeks to do. There are several benefits to this. The first is communicability. Using religion allows us to be on common ground with the majority of Americans. We can thus use religion to show, for example, why they shouldn't eat animals. The core principles of monotheistic religions include compassion, care for others, abstention from violence, and the love of God and all of its creation. If a religious person adopts these principles, it should be easier then to convert them to the quest of animal liberation. St. Francis of Assisi, the creator of the Franciscan monks, said this in regards to animal rights / liberation. If you have men who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you will have men who will deal likewise with their fellow men. In a passage in the Quran, it states, "He created the earth for all of its creatures. In it there are fruits and date palms with their hanging fruits, also grains and the spices. Which of your Lord's marvels can you deny?" These examples highlight the use of religion as a form of communication that creates an ethic around animal rights. The second benefit is abstinence. Many people who participate in religion in this country practice abstinence specifically against the eating of animals already. For example, Catholics give up eating meat on Friday during Lent. Hindus refrain from eating beef. Buddhists refrain from eating meat, etc. Beliefs like reincarnation, as my partner was pointing out in cross-sex, for example, rely upon an intimate connection with the spirits of the world and would not support factory farm progression and continued abuses on local and global scale of animals. Religion thus creates an ethical imperative with easy messages within the animal rights movement and helps decrease meat consumption in certain ways, whether they know it or not. Detaching completely from religion only risks isolating a large majority of these people and create further exclusion within animal liberation movements. The third benefit is community-based politics. Now, we know that Western thought has long been detached from place, the people who we are, and the communities that we are a part of, leading to much of the violence we see today. Joy H. Greenberg and Gregory Greenberg, in their article, Native American Narratives as Eco-Ethical Discourse in Land Use Consultation, explain why this is the case. They argue, lacking an archaic connection to not just land, but this land, the place where one finds oneself living, non-natives otherize their surroundings, which become mere objects for exploitation. Native spirituality understands the importance of place in political orientation and as crucial, and sees that the whole of creation as an active participant in ceremonial life. These forms of eco-cultural knowledge and creating connections that are important can be guided by these forms of spiritual principles. Anishinaabe academic Lawrence Groff believes that for his and other indigenous peoples, myths teach morality, especially environmental ethics. The importance of myths, for example, and storytelling, many of which can be found in the religious doctrines that we are discussing, can be used to establish these connections that are so vital for creating a community-based politics which furthers the goal of animal liberation. The fourth advantage is flexibility. Religion is a powerful source of morality and compassion and exists in many forms that can be adopted by many different people, leading to alternatives that we have not even started to understand, for example, Native American spirituality. Many of these principles are a direct attack on the current models of progress forwarded by the status quo, which rely on concepts such as science, with strict categorizations, concepts as survival of the fittest, and competition, and constant experimentation. Many options for animal liberation are born out of these discussions for spiritual values, such as compassion and ethics, and are important to keep in mind. Now, the proposition has said that religion as a vehicle for social change is problematic, but specifically how certain aspects of religious texts are anthropocentric. But our argument will be that we can create an interpretation of religious texts and beliefs that forefront animal liberation. These texts are thus not static and the end-all be-all. For example, Kim in the last speech gives the example of the Bible and quotes Genesis, but Kate Garvey contests that, quote, beginning in Genesis, human beings are commanded by God to be stewards of the animals. Many people look at chapter 1 in the book of Genesis and think this means we are entitled to own and use animals. But in the true meaning of the word, stewardship requires us to be guardians for animals. Now, the proposition has said that we need to discard religion and that the edifice should not exist. Our argument will be that this type of discourse is specifically what prevents us from bringing a diverse amount of religious experience and tactics into the fold and destroys the very modes of survival, for example, for Native peoples who have practiced spirituality in these forms of ethics prior to and after European invasion. Our argument will further be that these views risk homogenizing religion and bracketing all types of affiliation as problematic. The proposition is said that religion as a tool has been a tool to harm others, which will be an argument that they will make. Our argument will be that the secular focus on science, for example, and reason has justified many atrocities that focuses on this, and that once again, this will only reify a type of homogenization, i.e. that correlation does not imply causation. In examining the reason for why violence occurs, it is not enough just to blame religion, or blame secularism, or blame a cause, but rather understand the material realities that people face, and create specific focuses on empowering the youth and forwarding social justice in different ways. There is no reason, therefore, why animal liberation cannot occur through religion and its ability to free our minds in certain ways. Our argument is, how do we get to the question of anthropocentrism? How do we get to the question of speciesism? How do we get to this question of hierarchies and understand these functions and break them down through these types of religious affiliations? Our argument, furthermore, is not that atheism and that type of focus is inherently a bad political approach through animal liberation, but rather that these approaches must not be mutually exclusive, and that the blanket rejection that they call for of religion as that vehicle will only fail to solve for the issues of animal liberation. Thank you very much.
Drew Segal will now be cross-examined by Hugh Socha.
Okay, so my first question. You started by noting the
argument is not necessarily that they are like ethical actors, right? But more so that the way, if it's true that religion, for example, is a dominant part of government, right? That in order to ever communicate with these people or change people's minds or create any type of ethics around animal liberation, that we first need to have a discussion about religion with those people. So it's not that they're necessarily like the best people for racial discrimination or all that, but if a majority of people do affiliate with those type of religious beliefs, then the communicability aspect, we say, is very important to that question. And how do we talk to those people?
I'll just share, because you mentioned St. Francis of Assisi. Famous fable of St. Francis of Assisi is a peasant steals the feet, kills a pig of another peasant and cuts off the pig's feet to eat. St. Francis, although if he truly existed, which I'm sure he did, loved animals and called for some kind of stewardship of them, he clearly tells the peasant, animals are food for you, you must return the pig, even though the pig has been deformed, to the peasant, because animals are our property. How would you factor in that as a noble vision of St. Francis?
Got you. I mean, obviously, right, like, I'm not going to defend that statement is necessarily, like, good for animals, but rather our argument is that it's not a question of necessarily nitpicking at certain texts and being like, this is exactly what this person said. Our argument, rather, is that a lot of those interpretations, a lot of those texts are, for example, open to interpretation, i.e. the reading that we did of Kate Garvey countering the Genesis claim. So our argument is more, what type of ethics can we promote through certain forms of religious affiliation, i.e. ethics of care, compassion, those types of stresses would be more what we would say the focus should be on the question of answer.
Okay, my last question, I'll try to say quickly so you can answer.
Yeah.
You mentioned Native American traditions.
Yeah.
There are traditions that some of the myths, for example, there's the myth of Sedna, who is an Inuit goddess who sends the only animals who can be killed for food are those who the mother gives up. So I think in a sense we have to realize Native Americans, although they've been historically oppressed, have traditions that say animals exist for human purposes and actually willingly sacrifice themselves. So, and the other problem is, maybe more than that though, do you think it's appropriate to appropriate Native traditions as Euro-Americans who have settled here, to take their land and then take their religion, as if we could do that?
Gotcha. Should I just like give a...
Yes, that's fine.
I don't think like it's a question of reappropriating those types of traditions or like practices, but rather understanding how a lot of religion, for example, focuses on community building and land-based and spatial-based awarenesses, which our evidence, like the article that we are quoting for, indicates is key in order to create a form of connection to the earth that is necessary for types of animal liberation and creating those connections. So in terms of that process, I think many people can play a part in that kind of community-based spatial awareness that is not necessarily like a Euro-American reappropriating of tradition.
The proposition, Adam Wilkes, will now be speaking for 4 minutes.
Animals are our property. How can this be interpreted in a non-anthropocentric way fundamentally? Some aspects of religion can be a positive force. Yes, but when do we see an example of religion that isn't hierarchical, that is grounded and necessitated upon the idea and the notion that there is a higher spiritual force, a greater spiritual presence, something that is greater than ourselves and our beings, human or non-human? There is no, unless we see them bring up an example of a religion that is non-hierarchical in that sense, we're never going to get away from the idea that you can center the human affairs as more important than the non-human affairs. And I'm gonna go through their points now. Religion is a part of everyday life. That may be true now, but why not try and transcend that right in this room? Right now we're having this discussion on our religion and if its net impacts on society and the world are harm the cause of animal liberation more than support it. But we can push back against that by having this discussion right now and by coming to the conclusion that overall we see it being consistently more anthropocentric than not. Consistently more frequently in religions, Eastern or Western and Abrahamic, you will have, humans must have an ethical relationship with animals because it is a more humane thing to do and it is a more ethical thing for people to do. But then we are not ever moving towards the notion that we should, which is not anthropocentric and fundamentally egalitarian, that animals exist for their own purposes. In all of these religions, we are still centering anthropocentric ethics and the improvement and the well-being of humans. So as of now, is religion part of everyday life? Yes. Should we reject that? Of course, because that is the only way to move towards an ethical egalitarianism that includes all species. We can have elements of community that are not grounded in religious elements. And what we've seen with religious-oriented communities is the propensity to be violent towards other religious communities historically. Of course, there are multiple examples of religious-oriented communities that are peaceful and not contributing to interhuman violence. But why not move? But when we've already identified, and they essentially did concede this, that religions are fundamentally anthropocentric, why not have communities that are non-religious and not speciesist?
1 minute.
And they've said that there are examples of secularism that are genocidal. However, that's a I think that is a misinterpretation of the kind of secularism we're advocating, which isn't a rejection of ethical structures at all. It is more or less rejecting how religion and the values of it in the status quo are not doing anything for the more truly holistically egalitarian cause. So, what is the best way to open the cage door? As Kim said, a complete revolution in mentality away from religious and anthropocentric hierarchical thinking, because with the status quo religion, wherever it exists in the world today, animals are not existing for their own purposes. They are only existing for human comfort and ethics, as Kim said.
Adam Wilkes will now be cross-examined by Drew Segal for 2 minutes.
All right, so at the end you talked about like a revolutionary form of thinking. Can you like expand on like what that would look like?
The Institute for Critical Animal Studies, which is secular, and revolutionary, and in this room already functioning to critique society and push into new ways of thinking about the world.
And so you're arguing that structure must exclude religion because religion is hierarchical. Can you, I guess, explain like why is it that that is the case, especially like when we're talking about like, for example, Native American spiritual traditions that focus on the interconnectedness of spirits, for example, or different practices that do not necessarily promote those beliefs?
Well, I don't find at all that the ethical structure that the proposition is promoting is exclusive in the way that you're accusing us of being, right? So the notion of secularism isn't atheistic inherently. I mean, we're arguing atheism as a positive force, but secularism itself does not have to and does not exclude people who do identify with religion as an ethical
Yeah,
basis.
I mean, I guess I understand that, but you started off saying religion should not be allowed because it creates hierarchical structures. I'm asking you, I guess, if it's true that certain religions do not play a part in that, then how is it that, why can't we use religion as a social vehicle, which is like the debate that we're having, right?
We can, but
Okay.
well, I mean, no, religion religion is part of the conversation. It just can't be like we're arguing that it can't be like our
Part of
primary
the
constructed
structures,
ethics.
yeah. Okay, got you.
Yeah.
I guess so. Like, why is it that those forms of compassion or ethical callings that we discuss are problematic?
Why? What do you mean? What specific?
Like the promotion of the monotheistic religion. That's kind of the deal. Thank you for your.
I have 4 minutes, okay?
Yes. TJ Buckeret will now give a rebuttal speech for 4 minutes.
was, I think, what was the main point of Adam's speech was, why not have societies that are not religious? And while this may be a good question to have maybe in the future, I don't think it's the most productive question to have in the context of trying to work towards animal liberation right now. The question should be, how can we work towards animal liberation in the society that we have right now? And when that is the question, it is clear that working within a system where we can go to people who already have a set of beliefs and explain to them how those beliefs dictate that they treat animals with dignity and with respect and with equality, when we can do it that way, that is a much easier way to be able to explain to people why they should support animal liberation. But I think we all know it's hard enough as it is to try to get people to side with animal liberation in the first place because it's such a radical new way of thinking for them, and it's very hard to get them to see the world that way. If you try on top of that to try to discredit and get rid of the religious structure that they believe in their entire life, there is no way they're going to engage in that conversation with you. It won't happen. So the point of this is the best way in the status quo of our society to engage in animal liberation is to take things that people already believe and show them that since they believe that, and if they want to believe that, then they therefore must believe in animal liberation. And going to the point, again, I think there's a big point that even if they can point out to some interpretations of religion that are problematic, and there absolutely are, what we're saying is we need to forward the right interpretations of religion, the interpretations of religion that can forward animal liberation. So again, I'm going to go back to Kate Garvey, who said it's clear that animals are sacred to the Creator. The Holy Spirit is portrayed as a dove, and Jesus is called a Lion of Judea. To follow in Christ's footsteps means that we must form a right relationship with the animal kingdom. We must be guardians and adopt beliefs similar to Native Americans. All life is sacred. We live in a time where horrific atrocities are being inflicted on animals, factory farming, senseless and animal experimentation, and rising abuse and neglect of domestic animals. But there is hope. If the light of Christ can radically change the way we treat ourselves and each other, it can also change the way we interact with the animal kingdom. This is a viewpoint that we can take through Christianity as one example of those religions that we can use to create a viewpoint, to create a coalition around people who have religious views, but show them how those religious views don't conflict with animal liberation. And as Drew pointed to in his speech and in cross-examination, there's a good question as to the ideas of different religions existing, and how a lot of Native religions are focused around the basis of how they see the world. And our authors talk about how that is key to environmental ethics. It's a matter of under what structure do you see the world? And a lot of things we're talking about, compassion and morals and treating people with compassion, many of those are based in religious principles. And so when the problem is I don't really see when they talk about ethics on the proposition, I'm not sure where those ethics are coming from, and because if you're talking about morals and compassion, I think it's very clear that those ideas stem from religious principles, but be it whatever religion you want to look at. And so I think also you again go problematic, and even if they can show that religion has been used to harm animals, that has been problematic for animal liberation, the same thing can be said for things like science and reason. Because again, if we go by the principle of survival of the fittest, which is a large part of Darwin's theory of evolution, then that would justify that we should do whatever we want in humans, and that we should just kill all other animals and subjugate them because we have the ability. But instead we impose morals and moral restrictions upon that, and that's exactly how religion operates, where we have to impose moral restrictions on ourselves. Even if there is some false interpretation, we can turn it into an interpretation that is good for animal liberation.
TJ Buckard will now be cross-examined for 2 minutes by Adam Wilkes.
So how does this balance and inclusion of both religious and scientific concepts actively undermine ethics?
So what we're saying is that we're not saying that like an atheistic approach to attacking anthropocentrism is bad. What we're saying is when we're trying to engage in conversations with people who are not on our side, who we're trying to convert towards animal liberation, a way that we can go about that is to engage with principles that they already believe in, and then show them that those principles align with the view that we are trying to get them to see. And I think that is the most effective way in trying to further animal liberation.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but you want to use You want to engage with people's existing problematic beliefs in order to effectively change those problematic beliefs.
I mean, it's more in the way, even if you see their religious beliefs as problematic, I think we all agree that if we can use them to further animal liberation and get them to believe in animal liberation, even if those religious beliefs are problematic, that's at least a step in the right direction. Whereas if we try to attack both at the same time, we're not going to accomplish anything. Then nothing's going to get done. If we attack their religion and their views on the way animals exist in the world, the other person in that conversation is going to completely shut out and not participate in that conversation.
How many Americans engage with Native and Indigenous religions?
I mean, that's not really the question. Like, we're not saying that everyone engages in Native or Indigenous religions, but what we're saying is, first of all, we think a lot of the principles across religions, for the most part, there are certain principles that are in numerous religions that can be related. But also, it's a matter of when you try to discount all religion in the way that all religions exist, that shows that the problem is like, we're saying that the idea of religion is not problematic. Maybe some of the way it exists, but there are ways that religion can exist that is not problematic for animal liberation.
TJ Buckwright will now give a closing speech for 2 minutes.
So, in summation of our argument, I think that this has to come down to, even though there are definitely problematic ways in which religion exists and problematic interpretations of religion, I think that it is clear that we can utilize religion, and it can be a way that we can engage with the greater public as to how we can, how to fight anthropocentrism and how to forward animal equality. And so, I think the largest point here is that because everything is up for interpretation, because we can all have different views on things, we need to make sure that we are forwarding a view that they can relate, that other people can relate with. And so I think religion is an effective method to forward animal liberation, because we can forward ideas about Christianity, native animism, Buddhism, other religions, all the religions that people practice. We can forward these ideas and show them how they're inherently in line with animal liberation, which will help the cause. And then I think there's also the idea of how these religious practices allow us, as you talked about with the natives, allow us a good orientation towards nature, and that is inherent, that is necessary to environmental ethics and to liberation of animals, because compassion and ethics, I think we would all agree, are a large part of the arguments that are made. We have to care about these issues. No one is going to possibly, be involved in this if they don't care about animals, don't care about the suffering that is going on. And that is a theme that is inherent within religion. That's not something that science is going to offer you. Reason is not going to offer you emotion. It's not going to offer you a reason to care. It's going to offer you a reason to logically agree. But what we also need is a reason to make people care about these issues. And that's something that religion can do. We can teach people who are Christian, we can teach them that God wants them to care about animals, wants them to treat animals properly. I think that would be a stronger message to them than telling them that their religion is inherently problematic.
Kim Sosha will now give the proposition's closing speech for 2 minutes.
Okay. The opposition stated that we need to use religion as a foundation to take what religion says and to somehow make it kinder. If we had time, we could figure out, if possible, how to make kind the phrase from Genesis, animals will be food for you. How do we make kind Jesus Christ exorcising demons from a man, and instead of putting the demons into the abyss, he put them into swine, peacefully eating, who then dove into a lake and drowned themselves. How could that ever be made animal friendly? I think it's inherently impossible. I want to also note, kind of an aside, I believe we need to stop fetishizing Native American traditions. We need not to talk about them as if they are all encompassing. There were different tribal traditions spread throughout the Americas, so they are not one group who had a special connection with nature. Some may have more than others, but we need to look at them as individual groups, not as one holistic entity. I think the opposition in animals can be gleaned from religious texts. We can find ways to argue for stewardship, but not for true liberation. And that's the problem, is that's limiting. Atheist communities, I must state, secular communities are not free from religious thinking. I don't believe, because I'm an atheist, and it is an assumption about atheists, that science has all the answers. Science needs to be problematized. Science needs to factor in emotion as a rational reaction to animal suffering as well. So I don't think that's the answer. Secular thinkers are already driving the animal rights revolution, the animal liberation revolution. And we need to be honest about animals. And in our honesty about animals and our outreach, we have to be honest about what religion says about animals. And again, we may be able to get some welfare ideas gleaned from religious texts, but we will never get a true liberation if we're going to not be disingenuous.
We will now open up the floor for any questions for either the opposition or the proposition.
I have maybe for me and then for them, but I have to probably go in like 5 minutes.
Sure.
I have a question. In fact, because you presented the ethics of care and compassion as somehow being inherently religious, like as if you had a debate. It was an opposition between religion and pure rationality and reason on the other side. I mean, I would like to understand why, because I see ethics of care and compassion as being one with rationality and reason. For instance, let's say if we rely on Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who are actually now explicitly accepting that the reason why we all as human beings have the right to bodily integrity, respect of bodily integrity, liberty, and right to life is not because of our rationality or autonomy, but it's because we are all selves who care about what's happening to us. And this made possible the recognition of rights of children and people with disabilities. And I think that you don't need any religion to bring the care ethics in this approach and accept that these are the same reason why we should acknowledge it to all animals, all vulnerable selves, all beings who can recognize that they experience their life in some subjective ways. So my question basically is, how can you appropriate the ethics of care and compassion to the religion side and pretend that the atheist and reason side would be like devoid of this care ethics?
I can also, we can.
Yeah. Well, I think that's definitely a good question. I don't think we were necessarily. I think what we were trying to show was rather not that like atheists are inherently devoid of care and compassion. They're only focusing on science and logic. But I think we're trying to say that these systems of ethics and these systems of care and compassion and a lot of like these lessons that are taught, I think come from religious texts and come from religious spirituality. So even if that has become, say, a secular part of our culture, that's definitely true. But what we're saying is to deny that aspect of it and to deny that religious spirituality of it would then be to would be denying the care and compassion. Because I think he was absolutely right when saying that atheists are not completely devoid of religious influence. And I think that is also kind of our point, like that when they talk about care and compassion and talk about ethics, they're already kind of basing themselves on what has a lot been established in religious doctrine. So I think that's our point as to why, even if you're not fully focusing on religion, to disregard it completely as not at all, and even problematize it, I should say, would I think would be false, because a lot of our logic and reason has already been based on issues of care and compassion that have been established in religion.
Yeah, and the other aspect I would bring up is I think when we're making those criticisms, it's more of like the Western notion of progress as detached from sort of the communities that we are. So for example, right, when we think about like Western thought, a lot of it is detached from the places that we are, for example, as opposed to certain religious notions of care and ethics. So a lot of literature, for example, about Kant and universalizing principles, for example, a lot of the criticisms that are launched against that have to do with that form of detachment. So it might not be like a criticism necessarily of secularism, but rather a criticism of the way in which like Western thought has allowed for a type of detachment from scientific rationale and progress, I think is also another important part.
Can I say something first? I just want to make sure, like, I want to be, just identify, we need to avoid the either or binary. You have religion or you have science. Religion and science are extremely similar. And there's a great book, Shikibu Hutchinson, I don't remember the name of the book, where she talks about racial issues and that they share so much this sense of authority, and they work together at times. And I'll just give one example, and I know Cassie, the largest Christian group are Catholics in the whole world. Although those numbers are debatable, because I would be considered a Catholic because I was baptized as a Catholic, but obviously that's not the case anymore. And the Holy See, the Papal Court, the Vatican has clearly stated animals can be used for scientific research without question, except for human embryos. You know, you can't remove an embryo or a fetus from if the fetus is 3 weeks old, because that's a precious life. But animals are at the disposal of humans for food and for scientific purposes. So I just really wanted to make sure we're not making a false dichotomy. Science and religion often work very closely together.
So this is actually something that I studied, right? I'm very interested in the role that religion plays in motivating action in the social world. And it turns out it's really, really hard to determine in any case, no matter how narrow you make it, if you're looking at one person who did one thing, how much motivation came from this thing and how much came from another, right? And there's this really fabulous book, Ambivalence of the Sacred by Scott Appleby. And he tries to answer the question, does religion motivate peacekeeping more often than it motivates violence making, right? And so it's basically just case studies. It's pages and pages of case studies. And he gets to the end of it, right? And you're like on the edge of your seat, like, answer the question, answer the question. And what he says is, well, it's case by case. That religious is ambivalent about morality, right? It just depends on circumstances, what's going on in the world socially, who's leading the movement, right? What are the other factors? And that's, to me, like, it kind of makes this sort of debate, you know, more interesting and more challenging, right? Because I kind of agree with Appleby that it is ambivalent, right? So on the one hand, we're afraid of stuff that happens in religion that could subvert animal liberation. But on the other hand, how is that not true of anyone else in the world, right? You know, we all have pressures acting on us, whether they're religious or not, right? They're constantly subverting animal liberation, and people, you know, fall off the bandwagon all of the time. You know, there's a hostile environment towards us from leftists who otherwise share so many of our values. And so to me, it's like, well, I just would like to hear from both sides. How do you, you know, does that ambivalence change how you think about this question?
I'll just quickly say, I think perhaps this is a unique case. Perhaps the animal liberation movement is a unique case. Of course, I cite a study in here, and it's just one sociological study. Me and my sociological studies that clearly states a-religious people or people who are not religious are more drawn to liberal causes. There are less incidents of racism, less instances of anti-Semitism. So there's that to begin with. But I think perhaps the animal rights movement is a unique case because I've never heard anything to contradict this idea. We are, and this is not really, I mean, this is not to disrespect anyone who's religious and an animal rights advocate, but this is a secular movement. So I wonder, I guess I would wonder, like, is this because we are fighting for our other species? Our lives can remain comfortable even as animals suffer. So it's very unique in the history of social progress to fight for a species other than yourself. I could see being an ally and fighting for some of the different racial groups, which I try to do as well. But the idea of fighting for another species is so new. I don't know if, which I'd love to read the book. I don't know if maybe—
It's a big one.
Yeah, then I don't want to read it. If maybe the traditional way of looking at the world can factor in this very unique aspect of animal liberation. That would be my thought.
Building off what she said, I agree with all those points, and I also think that only in a very secular environment will you have the critical thought that can emerge and then question the anthropocentric underpinnings you'll have in elements of religion. Of course, there are various religious philosophers. I'm not saying like critical thought can't come from religion, but it's definitely far more challenging when you have a mode of social organization that all gravitates towards like a regimented structure. The Bible, the Quran, right? You know, most religions do have their set of rules and standards, and atheists for the most part, coalesce around a bunch of different literature bases and believe believe a bunch of different things, and it's not as much a rigid, centralized code of ethics and living. And I think that's
Maybe. I mean, that's disputable, you know, like, another question to both sides, like, who owns the ideology, right? Like, so for example, would you want to be lumped in the same category with, say, you know, Dawkins and Dennett on some moral issue just because, you know, you're both atheists? Like, you know what I mean? It's unclear.
I mean, I do address that, and I guess,
Yeah.
I don't know how this works, but, because I address it, because I address it in the book, I want to note that this is not, I don't make the argument, I'm highly critical of Dawkins and, mostly Dawkins and Harris, Sam Harris in the book, in the second chapter. What I argue, kind of picking up on what you were saying, is I argue that it allows for more progress in that area. And what's interesting, because you don't have to keep returning to these texts and traditions, you don't have to hold it against something up there or around.
So there's more sources for moral inspiration.
Absolutely, and just a quick thing that you probably find extremely interesting and extremely frustrating is Dawkins and Harris. I really interrogate their work. They continue a very long tradition when philosophers first began to think about animals, like in the 18th century in the West. I'm totally thinking from a Western perspective here. They would start to consider the rights of animals, but stop short of actually acting on it. And we see that happening here. If you actually read, I mean, you'd be blown away by some of what Dawkins and Harris say. They have an ethics. They are arguing for animal liberation. They are arguing these animals are not ours to use. This is a problem, but they stop short. I think some of the best arguments for animal liberation are coming from the atheist community. The problem is they're coming from people who are not acting on their own ethical conclusions, which is just so frustrating.
I really do. I think your question is a great one. I think that was definitely something that this debate was kind of getting to. I think, for example, when Kim brought up Genesis, and then we gave a alternate interpretation of Genesis, and then we kind of went back and forth on that. I think that is very much, I think, one of our points is that these scriptures, especially, are things that are open to interpretation. So I personally don't necessarily agree that it's as a as a practicing Catholic, I don't necessarily agree that it's as a strict code as it's put out there to be, because I think there is very much room for interpretation, as much of what is put in the Bible is often not seen to be taken literally. For that reason, there is a lot room for philosophical discussion and debate regarding what the actual meaning of what is said. And so I think definitely for that reason, I think it's important to kind of understand how the personal is involved within, like, how you make decisions. So I think the case by case basis is definitely true, because, you know, I could have a read of the Bible that is entirely different than someone else who reads the Bible. And so for that reason, and absolutely, I think in terms of how you act on your ethics and how religion influences you is absolutely a case by case incident.
I guess I would ask, and I really do have to leave, I'm not trying to have the last word, which is really good, but I do have a point. I can't imagine how you could ever interpret a passage of animals will be food for you as go vegan.
Yes.
In what, like, it involves not even an intellectual gymnastics. You have to remove all intellect from a proposition.
Well, I mean, for me, I think it is also a part of what is core to the reading and what is core to the scripture. Like, for example, I don't think necessarily believing that is inherent to being a Catholic. Like, I don't think that is one of the things within the Bible, because there is a lot said within the Bible. So I don't necessarily think that if you disagree with that, or if you don't live in that lifestyle, then it's the view that God doesn't see you as a Catholic anymore. So I think it's a matter that, like, it's kind of like, I don't think it needs to be as strictly followed as is being implied, because I think there's kind of a priority as to, like, what are the biggest duties of life, and what are the biggest issues, and then what is kind of just things that are also said in the Bible that aren't necessarily needing to be followed in order to be a Catholic.
I can agree you can be a Catholic and a vegan, but I believe fully that you have to be, if if you're Catholic and vegan, it's in spite of religion, not because of it. With that, I drop the mic. I really do have a flight to catch, unless if you guys can continue your talk.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just can't.
Thank
Yeah.
You can still take, but yes.
Yes.
Yeah, well, my question was, I cannot cite chapter and verse from the Hebrew Bible. But as I recall, originally God decreed that for humans, only plants would be considered food.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And then subsequently, I believe after the flood, God said that I, in disappointment over you humans, give you permission to eat meat or eat animals.
It said we
But
have to leave that.
that God's original decree and mandate was that we be, as humans, be vegan. Now, I don't know whether that should be interpreted as an ethical mandate or from some other standpoint, but the point is that I don't recall where in the early books of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, God said that animals shall be food for you. Is that what
I mean,
he said?
there definitely are, I think, interpretation of that in Genesis, but a lot of where your thinking comes from is definitely, and I personally agree, is through the description of Eden. When Eden is taken into consideration as the perfect world that God created, animals are described to live in harmony with humanity. But when then the world obviously changes once Eden is forsaken and they're cast to the earth. And so once that happens, obviously the dynamics of earth change. But I would agree with you that in a reading of the Bible, God's perfect world is one in which animals are living in harmony with humanity.
But would you agree with the proposition as was recently put out it was quoted in the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago, that the Humane Society of the United States, in trying to get evangelicals to care somewhat about animals, stated that we agree that God put animals here for humans to consume. Is that, in your opinion, or your reading, is that an accurate reading of Genesis or the early books of the Bible?
I don't believe so personally, having read both the Old Testament and the New Testament, that I don't believe that that's an accurate reading. I think that's kind of an example where animal rights movements are kind of caving to religious groups, and I don't think that's necessarily what we're advocating. Rather, what I think animal rights groups should do is look at the text of the Bible and make it almost indisputable to Christians that if you are going to follow this text, it's very evident that you have certain obligations to non-humans.
But, do you mind if I interrupt? What is the point of even having guidelines for a religion if you're going to choose to interpret them in any ethical direction you want?
Well, but that's why I think that it's not, I disagree that there are necessarily guidelines to being a Catholic, mainly because the Bible itself was a collection of books that were decided to be good, not all the books that were written as scripture. For example, Mary Magdalene's book was never actually included in the Bible because at that time, women weren't supposed to be writing, and so the European kings weren't going to put Mary Magdalene's book into the Bible. And so for that reason, I don't necessarily agree that like Catholicism is a club that you get kicked out of if you don't follow the bylaws, personally.
Yeah, I mean, like, we're talking, specifically about Christianity right now, which is one religion out of many, right? But I think the Genesis story as like an animal liberation story, right? There's two ways that people have looked at it. There's sort of the negative anti-liberation way, right? Which is, Adam names the animals, it's dominion, right? It's predicating what's going to happen on Earth, right? Where animals are used and abused, and it's justified by this act of naming, right? And that's problematic. But I think, there's this equally valid interpretation that, one, in the Christian utopia, there is no violence, even between harmonious, and so what happens here on Earth is a product of sin, right? It's the failure of humanity to be what God wanted us to be. But like the act of naming, right, which is so often, vilified by animal liberationists, right? Because, that's how man decides what animals are. Or, what I think could be a more generous interpretation is, that's the act of making other species ethically relevant to humanity, right? Because we name those things that we love. We name our children, we name the places where we live, we name our communities, you know, we name our pets, and we do that precisely because we're saying, well, you're not just some abstract thing, you're this person to me now, right? And so, well, which version is correct, right? That's where the argument is, but it seems to me like if you want to just say, well, the Genesis story is just about dominion, it's just about patriarchy, and it's just about how animal abuse happens, that's such a cynical reading, right? There's another possibility, which to me is a very beautiful, you know, utopian story. So, you know, who owns that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
I just want to make a quick announcement, and then you can continue the conversation. When you're done, they're doing prison letter writing in 140, and then after that, we're going to do a hike through the nature preserve for anybody who's interested. But feel free to continue the discussion here. I just have to write for people at the airport.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'm gonna go.
No one else is acting to ask for help.
Is everyone ready to say? I think you had a really great point, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's ambivalent, you know?
Yeah.
People don't want to eat their pets, right? You don't want to eat animal race because they know them on a personal basis.
Yeah.
I can't name these livestock because when I do, that's when the relationship is ethical.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? So it's like, well, there is this like damaging patriarchal story, right? And I know what these things are and I'm the decider, but it's also like, it could be.
Yeah, it gives
Now
them
we're
an identity.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, like, the scientists don't like to name their lab animals for the same reason.
Right, right, because all of a sudden there's responsibility.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who name their farm animals.
Yeah, me too.
You know, yeah. Wow.
It's, yeah, I question them, but they feel that their animals are there to be taken.
Right.
Oh, no, I'm talking
Right.
about the driving.
That was
Oh.
my dilemma.
What did you
Yeah.
get then? Oh, reform
But they
versus revolution?
eat how
Oh, yeah.
Like, oh, you're eating.
And were you on the side of,
Exactly, exactly.
were you on the side of
I was
revolution?
inside a relation, but the person who we were debating.
Yeah, that's rough.
So that's fake.
It was a weird debate.
That must be,
It was a
that must be tough.
Yeah, right, well, exactly, who owns the story, yeah.
Yeah, I think the animals thing is such a Western thing too, I think. 'Cause
That'd be
if you
like
look,
Joe on the
They
cat
do
thing.
name the animals that get used for tourists. Tourists.
One second.
He does?
What's the worst name?
I think that's one of
name?
He runs
But
the
if you
weird,
ask the
like,
guy with the donkey,
like
in the street,
calf-
he's like, are you
cow
kidding?
raising.
He's like, it's a donkey, we don't name donkeys, that's crazy talk.
Separated Jane Goodall from the science field. She named the chimpanzees, and science said to her, you can't do that when she was researching. She's like, oh, well, why not? But the first intention was, okay, I'm gonna name them.
I'll be able to keep track.
Yeah, be able to know who's who and when.
Right.
I said, no, you can't name your supervisor. This was like sixties, I think she was there, 50s, 60s. And I said, you can't do that. And she said, you know what? Screw you. I'm
Yeah,
Jane.
Right, I'm Jane Goodall.
Well, I mean, this is before she was
Right,
taking
yeah.
over.
And they have to identify them anyway, so what are they doing, numbering them?
But the-
Trying to be impersonal,
But I
yeah.
think that's so quantitative and so scientific,
Right.
and so separating yourself and making the hierarchy by saying that I'm above you.
Right.
So I think naming those actually kind of make you say, hey, you know what, we are similar.
Right, exactly.
So-
Yeah, it's weird, it can work, you know, in different directions, and it's not clear which one we should go with.
For
and-
sure. I
Yeah.
feel like somebody should write a paper about this.
Right. It could be
About
a
the
good one.
active